All right, let's continue to get reaction to Cyril Ramaphosa's cabinet reshuffle. We're joined by Professor Ivor Sarakinsky from the Wits School of Governance. Prof, good evening. Certainly, at least from the last comments that the President was making there, he sounds like he's getting ready for the sixth administration and this realignment and reconfiguration. It almost feels like, 2 steps forward and then 5 steps back and then a catch-up game when you look at how this telecommunications department has been broken up, brought back together, and now we're back in that point where, of course, it's being re-amalgamated.
So he's signaling a whole range of things to us that will happen should the ANC be the governing party in June 2019. And the one is the crunching together of a whole range of departments. So you've got 3 or 4 or even 5 economic departments. Crunch them into one super economic ministry and the savings will be immense. And you can do that across government and in that way reduce the number of ministers and the costs associated with so many ministers. So why isn't he doing that now? It's easy, it's not as complex as I think the President is suggesting. And it may well be because of ANC politics. You reduce the size of cabinet, you've got people...
You reduce the employment rate.
No, but they still sit in the NEC. Mm-hmm. And that's where he's got to get consensus on his policy agenda. So he'd rather have people in the cabinet looking out and instead of having angry people in the NEC looking in terms of enabling him to achieve his goals. So this caution... and I think this caution will continue after the election as well, because the political dynamic in the ANC isn't going to change. This caution is what I think.
So are you saying that even though he is signaling to more to come in terms of how government is going to be realigned, it may not necessarily take place at the scale that it could?
Indeed. And it's because of ANC dynamics and the power balances that will determine the extent of the restructuring that will take place.
Of course, there's also the question about the work that is being done by these departments, Prof, because you now have people that were in whatever positions that they were serving in both departments, which I understand are going to continue functioning, but reporting to the communications minister. So when they're brought together, what happens to that workload? What happens to the important projects such as digital migration, which has been sitting with the communications ministry for years now? That could potentially be stalled even further.
Potentially, but probably it won't. In fact, the status quo will continue because your directorates, your units in government, in the bureaucracy, will continue as before. There will just be a different structure of political reporting too. So instead of 2 separate ministers, you'll have one minister who will receive reports from 2 different bureaucratic structures. So the budgets, the commitments, the promises, the milestones in terms of the policy agenda ought to continue as is. Whether they will or won't is a separate issue, but I don't expect any turbulence there.
All right, let's talk about then the reshuffle as far as Minister Nomvula Mokonyane is concerned. What's your reading into it?
A lost opportunity to put someone into a really important ministry, a ministry with a fantastic track record of achievement under Minister Molewa. And now we've got a minister who's come from water affairs and sanitation with a track record that is unenviable. And all the achievements, all the successes that have been achieved in terms of climate change policy, environmental protection, anti-poaching, all of that stuff, which is the responsibility of Environment Affairs, is under a minister who has a track record that people wouldn't be envious of.
Do you think that there was any politics when it comes to the maneuvering that you've been talking about that went into this decision, and what could that have been, especially when you look at who then is also appointed as Nomvula Mokonyane's replacement?
Well, she's a powerful figure in the ANC, she's a powerful figure in the NEC. And in order to keep her either quiet or on his side, he has to give her a powerful ministry. So there's no doubt there's been a trade-off in bringing her into Environment Affairs. It's in order to draw her into the Cyril camp or to make her obligated to him in order for her not to obstruct or align herself too closely with the other faction in the ANC. It's a political calculation, and it may have negative consequences for the Department of Environment Affairs.
And the president also just sounded to be quite intentional about the generational mix, as he called it. And of course, we now have Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams as the new communications minister. Do you see this at all, speaking to issues that were raised when Malusi Gigaba was resigning, and the collective of at least the one faction that is said to be with him, that said young people are actually being sidelined by this administration?
Could well be a response to that criticism that emerged when Gigaba resigned. There was an attempt to cast it in generational terms. The old guard doesn't want the new generation to lead. So he's played that one quite cleverly. But there he's found merit to correlate and correspond with the politics of the time. In terms of environment affairs, the politics dominated.
It generally does feel that it's business as usual, Prof. This is, of course, against the backdrop of an anticipated or expected new dawn. And if we are to really change how government does its business, does the current model that we're working within ensure that we do anything significant to what has happened before?
It's terribly cautious. And the politics of that caution we understand in terms of ANC factions. But the president has the discretion to appoint cabinet. And he could have been more adventurous, I think. And I think he could have been more adventurous much earlier in his presidency than he has been then and now.
But the alliance partners seem happy, at least by judging by what they were telling Vuyumvoko a little bit earlier. Doesn't count the fact that they seem to be appeased, and so the rest of us must just live with it, I guess.
Well, of course they're happy. With a cabinet of 35-odd people, members of the various parties in that alliance can have access to seats. If you crunch the cabinet down to 20, which is what it should be, it means that you've really got to be competitive, and you've got to have merit to hold one of those cabinet positions. And that's when the uncomfortable decisions will be made, and that's when we'll see some of these dynamics in terms of factions and ambition and disputes coming out into the forefront when the shrinkage comes. It has to come. South Africa can't afford a cabinet of 35 and double deputy ministers. We just can't do that.
Well, we'll have to wait and see if indeed it actually ever gets there, Prof. Professor Ivor Sarakinsky from the Wits School of Governance. Motao Khwaripe is standing by with your news for tonight. Your business news, Motao, good evening.
Evening, Kathy. Of course, we're focusing on the